Hello, and welcome once again to another fun-filled heretical episode of Inside the World of Mack's Headroom. Today, I actually kind of apprehensively want to talk about George Floyd, the unfortunate African American dude who got murdered by a nasty cop and probably all kinds of extenuating circumstances in front of 18 million people in the midst of the COVID-19 virus and a presidential election. What a series of events. Now, before I go on, of course, I want to say what everybody else who's commented on the subject has said, especially regarding Mr. Floyd, excuse me, is that, of course, what do you say? That was one of the most hideous things in the world. And just to imagine yourself being in that kind of situation, to me, is just unspeakable. And so, again, I want to just go on record before I start talking that, I hold not only the police themselves, but especially the cops that were surrounding it and blocking people from saying, get away. And that compounded by, the whole institutionalized racism, uh, police violence against mostly black males narrative, put that all together, and it's just a nasty, horrible scene. So let's just accept that, okay? And again, my sympathies to the Floyd family and anybody else who's affected directly or indirectly by that sort of maybe just that act or the recapitulation or the metaphor of what that means to people from having seen similar things happen before. Let's just accept that as such, and my regrets again, okay? um, I do, however, or not however, just and I also want to just tell you about some experiences that I've had uh, as I'm 67 years old that involve riot situations in response to something, often racial. Okay. Uh, for instance, not always racial, but I've been in, I mean, in my years of life, I haven't been in the riots themselves, but I've been witness to them either on the media or friends that were there or whatever. And I just want to review a couple of them. One was the 1968 Democratic Convention, in which all of Grant Park and Michigan Avenue went on fire. Plus, I think that was mostly what happened. But I mean, it was very awful. I think equally probably as awful. And of course, there were racial issues because Chicago, in itself, just at that time, especially, just bred racial issues. And so I, was witness to that. I was also witness to, the aftermath and rioting related to Martin Luther King, which in Chicago, where I'm from, again was, I guess what you might call an epicenter of the riots. The aftermath. I'm not talking about anything related to race or the reason. I'm just talking about riots that seem to sometimes either be sparked by something racial or not. Um, Also, I was witness almost I was a participant to the. I don't know how much you know about this, but it'd be interesting to Google it or something if you're not. If I refer to it kind of glibly, which was the famous Chicago Sly and the Family Stone Riot, which happened probably in 1969, where people were throwing potatoes with spikes in them and stuff like that. I fortunately I would have been there, but I had to work as a lifeguard. It's like I was 16 at the time. So I've lived through a bunch of riots. Now that's not to mention the fact that also when I was in fifth grade, President Kennedy got shot by one person, of course. Um, I was around with Bobby Kennedy getting shot. I was around for the Manson thing. I was around for just all kinds of very hideous things. But especially, I'm just sort of familiar with riots. Not that I participated in them. I was always a little bit young for that, but certainly was witnessed via the media, via my friends whose parents had stores in certain neighborhoods that got looted. All of Michigan Avenue, I think, at one point was looted. Like I said, my friend who went to this famous Sly and the Family Stone thing, I was a lifeguard. He came back running, like panting. It was maybe 10 miles away. He came back, oh my God, you're not going to believe what happened. I couldn't believe it. You know what happened? Sly and the Family Stone came late to a free concert at Grant Park. Now, Sly and the Family Stone, if you know who they are, were very famous for coming late. So they did exactly what was expected to them, but this giant riot broke out, okay? Now, what that sort of leads me to is the subject, I guess, of riots. Because I think everybody would agree, even regarding George Floyd, that you know the after rioting is not appropriate. Okay, and so let's be real clear about that. I would say what I think the governor and mayor both of Minnesota have said. It's just intolerable. But one thing that I want to mention is that with all the riots and the assassinations, as I mentioned before, that I've lived through in my 67 years, seems to me like there's always some sort of underground catalyst. And I'm not talking about the catalyst that you see on the surface, like even like race. I don't think. I mean, yeah, everybody's pissed off, but I don't see the honest people that were demonstrating, whether they're white or black, doing the looting. What about that knucklehead that was running around, a white guy with an umbrella over his head, breaking the windows of the AutoZone? That guy wasn't a peaceful protester. And then now there's talk that I guess people from various little subsystems, I guess they label them as extremely left. I'm not sure why, but that's how I've heard on the news. Have infiltrated Minnesota to kind of act out their own axe to grind, whatever that is. But with all these riots, there's always some sort of underlying thing. I think with the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago, I think that was allegedly motivated by, I think, the FBI and perhaps the weathermen working together. I mean, there's always some sort of underground group stirring the pot and taking advantage of the spirit of the times, the zeitgeist, for instance, or some sort of oftentimes racial issue that's legitimate, that's existing, but then it gets manipulated and twisted to make it look like it's a real honest effort to protest against civil rights or pro-civil rights, rather. But in reality, it goes to I bet you 99% of the people who were out there protesting weren't the ones that were looting and breaking shit. They were either opportunistic or planted individuals. I saw some movies of guys driving trucks up with like pallets of wood that were ready to be burned. That isn't a reactionary action. That's a planned. It's not spontaneous reaction. That's a planned action that worked probably from the underground. Now I know I'm not trying to sound like David Icke or anything like that, but when you look at this particular thing that happened in Minnesota, I have to just ask myself a couple of questions, okay? One is, why is it happening now? Why did this horrible thing happen now? Amidst the COVID virus, amidst all this tension between the United States and China, right? Let's see, do I have anything else written down? Well, oh yeah, the Joe Biden, who's running on primarily a racial platform, it seems to me, all this stuff is happening. President Trump is kicking and screaming, but I think he's on his way out. And the country, besides the burden of the COVID virus, besides the burden of a changing presidential thing, which is probably going to happen with a guy going down kicking and screaming and blaming everybody else, amidst the fact that there's tension that's never been existed before between us and China, given the fact that we have, I'm sorry, but in my opinion, a very empty, probably future candidate who rides largely on the race card, I think that, all of a sudden, if you start a city on fire where the National Guard has to come in, you've created a chaotic experience. And if you look at all great, I'm not no scholar or anything, but or historian, but if you look at it, like a lot of great people, Castro, Hitler, people like that that created revolutions, the one thing they did at first was to start internal chaos. And as long as there's internal chaos, like, as a system, there's no structure to hold it together, and it's kind of makes the system very weak. And so I guess, in closing, have to ask myself, and I don't know I have some theories, but I'm not in a position to really share them. But I'm real curious to know, why did this happen now? Why was it just a coincidence that this happens when the country is bombed by the COVID virus, ready to change presidents probably, with someone who I think a lot of people would say is not exactly the guy they'd want to vote for, who's running on a racial ticket. We're also ready to fight China, it seems like, in some way. We got all these other countries sort of looking at us. We're like under the hourglass, or is that the right way? Under the eyeglass, because, even though everybody else has beefs with China, we seem to have all of a sudden become the leaders, like we always do. We're gonna represent the whole world in this, even though like the Australians can't stand them either. So with all this crazy shit going on, isn't it interesting that what could happen is a contagion of this kind of crazy acting out behavior, which most Americans would agree is not appropriate. The punishment isn't, equal to the crime in terms of this guy being blatantly and horribly and racially murdered. But my question actually is, was this guy planted to do that? Oh boy. Yep, that's a weird one, isn't it? Wouldn't it be interesting if somehow he was planted for some purpose to be a white cop who kills a black man, who starts this thing that then gets fueled by all these other people who we don't really know. We just know that they're coming from other places, and then all of a sudden the whole city of Minnesota burns down. What does that look like to the rest of the world? It looks like a chaotic, fucking crazy place, worse than it was before that happened. Okay, so I'm not trying to answer who done it or who's responsible, but I really do question that, was this just the act of like institutional racism in the Minnesota Police Department? I don't think so. It is an example of institutional racism in the police department across America, period. We know that. There's all these other stories. But I'm saying isn't it so coincidental that this happened whenever the world's up for grabs? And now the world's even more up for grabs, and we look like tremendously chaotic and like we don't know what the fuck is going on, and our country's burning from the inside. And everybody's looking at the master power in the country like we're a bunch of idiots at a time of transition. It's too coincidental for me. We're too vulnerable right now. So maybe everybody should look down inside and try to figure out what might be taking advantage of this awful incident that happened, or what might have even been behind why a white cop ends up murdering an innocent black guy. It could be just plain old racism, maybe so, but maybe not. Maybe a combination of both, who knows? But I can't accept the fact, just like I couldn't accept the fact that, whatever the Democratic Convention was about, allegedly why they were protesting, it turns into a riot. Please, once it turns into a riot, you're no longer involved in anything that's intellectual, anything that's ideological. The Sly and the Family Stone concert, which happened at the same time, again, the spirit of the times. I think it happened in 1969. The Democratic Convention happened in 1968. Kind of coincidental, isn't it? The whole world was up for grabs then. The Sharon Tate thing followed later. And one thing, this may sound very conspiratorial, and I don't know exactly how to put it, but this whole thing sort of has this sort of weird sort of flavor of the whole helter-skelter ideology. Now, I'm not saying Manson's behind it. I sure hope not. But I'm talking about, using the idea of race to create havoc, which then some group can come out on top after everybody's killed themselves. Now, I know that was made up by a crazy man, and I'm not really saying this is helter-skelter, but it just sort of reminds me a little bit of it. And, Manson was a smart guy, and who knows who could maybe want to be doing that as well. Because I don't think any of the people that have been, protesting the injustice of what happened to George Floyd would support earnestly what's going on now. It's happening. You could say maybe it's the animalistic nature of man and just opportunists are coming out, but they're coming in from other states. That's what they're saying in Minnesota. So I don't know. You guys can make up your mind. I've been watching this like all weekend long, and I just felt the need to put it down on tape, even though I said I wasn't going to comment on it. I decided to do it, and we'd see what happens. So, hope you get my point. I think perhaps we need to look a little bit wider to understand what's going on. I think there's something conspiratorial happening, and maybe I'll be famous. You can call me Mack or something. I don't know. I'm teasing. Anyway, thank you very much. I bid you adieu, and stay safe out there. Okay. And again, thank you once more for being with me on another episode of Inside the World of Mack's Headroom. Oops. Bye.